welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am so excited about this interview. We're here to talk about an absolutely gorgeous novel, a work of medieval historical fiction that touches on so many of my interests. It's really fascinating, and I can't wait to get into it. Welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Absolutely. My name is Janet Rich Edwards, and I just want to say I'm so excited to talk to you in particular, Jen, because I know you have a degree in medieval history. So it's going to make this discussion like so much more rich. I'm going to talk today about my book, Canticle, coming out in December, which is grounded in what is arguably the first women's movement of Western history. It's set in 13th century Bruges, and it follows the story of Elise, a headstrong young woman who's prone to mystical visions. Soon after we meet her, she's fleeing an unwanted marriage, and she finds refuge with a self-sufficient community of independent women who refuse the rule of the church, which in the 13th century was really novel and suspect, actually. When Elise begins to perform what might be miracles, the sort of rising fervor of Bruges, of the townfolk, attracts the attention of an ambitious local bishop. And of course, trouble ensues. It's a story about faith, about doubt, quite a bit about literacy and the quiet rebellion, women who are fighting for knowledge and the independence that can bring.
It's so beautiful and it touches on so many of my interests back from my research days. Before we get into the book itself, could you tell us a little bit about your journey as a writer? I know that you are also a professor. How did you come to writing about medieval history, given your research history?
It's a really good question. I'm actually a scientist. I'm an epidemiologist who does research in women's health at Harvard Medical School and Harvard School of Public Health. And I came to writing late. I came to writing about the time I turned 50. My kids had left home, work was sort of getting easier. I'd done it for a real long time. And I thought, either I can double down and work more or I can try a new trick. And I'd always been a reader of fiction, of novels. Ever since I was a little kid. And I thought, it'd be fun to try. And from the very first sentence I wrote, I was hooked. I just love it. I love the process. It's sort of a different part of my brain. And I'm lucky to have had the support to be able to do it, with a late start.
That's so interesting. And what drew you to the medieval period in particular?
So when I was young, I came across the female medieval mystics. And I was so impressed with them. I hadn't had much of a religious upbringing. Was sort of a, vaguely Christian, but not very strongly educated, and came across these women who, in centuries, with plague, famine, war, a church that was consumed with punishment, are relating visions, purportedly from God, that are exclusively about divine love. So these women, through calamity, they're so full of passion and joy that I just remembered their words. And then many years later, I got more curious about their lives and how brave they were, because to speak out in that era and saying you were getting divine showings from God was really risky. At that time, as a woman who claims that is either going to be sort of like accused of being possessed by demons or a vessel of God. And it really went both ways. You've got some mystics who are advising popes, or who are allowed, like Matilda of Magdeburg, allowed to say things like priests are stinking billy goats. But you get others who are just dismissed as having distempered brains, or have their writings attributed to men. And a few who are actually so persecuted that they're burned at the stake. So I was really interested in creating a character sort of in this vein, and wondering what her life would be like. Like, what would a woman make of these showings if they started happening to her? Would she herself believe in the miracles that people might be attributing to her? I thought she might have some doubts. And so that's Elise, my main character. And then you've got the Beguines that we'll talk about, the women who are, sort of form their own quasi-religious communes who have a really bread and butter practical religion based on charity, who I fell in love with when I met them historically. And then you've got the ambitious bishop, and you've got a spiritually envious friar. And so you sort of got all aspects of this moment of religious foment in the late 13th century.
Yeah, you use all of the, sort of main characters, Alais, Lucas, the mendicant, the friar, and the bishop, his brother, and in highlighting all these different characters from these different segments of Christianity at the time, you really explore what a period of upheaval it was for the church and for its power hierarchies and how many new developments were seen as a threat by the institutional church. And so all of these, dynamics are so complex and interesting, and you use these characters to explore them in a really interesting way.
It was really fun diving into that and sort of working within the guardrails of history. In historical fiction, you have sort of, the privilege of making stuff up, but I didn't want to do that. And there was enough fascinating stuff going on that I could sort of stay within the bounds of what was really happening and create these characters. Um, but yeah, they come into conflict a lot. We're sort of on the eve, there's the very beginning hints of the Reformation. The Bible is not available in languages other than Latin, and most priests can't even read it. There's a real distance between the people and their God, and people are getting restless about that. And they want more. And that's what comes through. They want more.
Mm. And that touches on one of the themes I think you mentioned before, literacy, and what a powerful tool it is in this world, and how closely guarded that tool is. Such a tiny part of the population was literate. Certainly women were not in many contexts expected to be literate, but Alace's interest in literacy is one of the many things that mark her as different from a lot of the people around her. So could you kind of use that to introduce us to Alace and tell us about shaping her as a character?
Sure. So Elise wants to read because of her mother, Psalter. Psalter is one of those tiny little daily prayer books, often illuminated. You think of illuminated manuscripts, they're quite beautiful. And they would have been lettered in Latin. And of course, the people who owned them, unless you were a nun in a convent or something, couldn't really literally read them. But they would sort of know the stories. So she would sit on her mother's lap, holding her mother's braid as ballast, and her mother would read the stories or make them up. And after Elisa's mother dies, what she really wants is to be able to read that Latin so she can get closer, almost like she can bring her mother back. And so, what is changing in Northern Europe, particularly in these like mercantile capitals at this moment, is because of the Crusades and all the commerce that comes up because of that. There was a growing merchant class, and so merchants were learning to read. They were learning to read in their vernacular. They were learning to read in Dutch. And in fact, some women were being taught to read in Dutch for those very reasons. But it was much more rare to find a woman educated in Latin, unless you were living in a convent, in which case you did get that education. So Elise finds ways to learn. And when she actually joins the Beguine, so I'm sure we'll talk more about, she discovers that there are actually a couple other women literate in Latin there. And that's where some of the interest in who has access to the Bible starts. As one character says, who cannot herself read, she's really frustrated. She says, God judges whether we'll spend eternity in heaven or hell, but Rome won't let us read his word. Yeah, it's a powerful theme.
And oh my gosh. So I'd love to talk. Oh, right. So, yes, let's talk about the Beguines a little bit more. All of the changes that we were talking about happening in the church were also happening for women in the church. There was an explosion of mysticism, of new forms of religious life for women. Could you talk about some of these things that you found, and particularly what drew you to the Beguines?
Yeah, I stumbled on the Beguines fairly late, and they ended up being a big, big part of the story. Around the year, 1300, if you were a woman, you didn't have many choices. Either you married or you joined a convent. That is, if you had the dowry to join a convent, which was sometimes pretty significant. And what happened was women began to form their own alliances, at first small households, um, and later what we call court beguinages or beginhofs, where many households of women would group together geographically, and they would form their own economic communities, often in cloth work, laundry at first, wool making, lace work. They refused to be under the same kind of rule of the church that nuns were. This made the bishops very nervous about them because they had a strong strain of mysticism that started coming through. And part of what kept them alive was that the mayors in these towns enjoyed the tax revenue because they were economically so successful, and the mayors would protect them from the bishops. So the Beguines were pious women. They took not firm vows, but they made pledges to each other, lives of simplicity, chastity, and charity. But you didn't have to remain in the beguinage. You could leave to get married. You could leave to become a nun. But a lot of women stayed for life.
And I think they compare and contrast really interestingly with the mendicant life that we see through Lucas, another sort of extreme, not extreme, but like another form of embracing the poverty and the charity aspects of the religious vocation. And they both sort of emerge at the same time for many reasons, but as a response to what a lot of people were seeing as like the increasing worldliness of the institutional church, as we see in the bishop. So, could you talk a little bit about that aspect, creating your story's antagonist, and maybe some of the dynamics that you were thinking about when you shaped him?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of interesting to contrast the main antagonist in the story, the bishop, Jan, and his brother Lucas, who is a friar. And I didn't know this when I started, the research, but I didn't really understand that friars were basically they'd sprung up in that century. You've got the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and they're basically street preachers who own nothing but the brown robes on their back and their begging bowls, and they're trying to live lives of poverty like Christ's apostles. The apostolic way is their sort of motto, right? So they're showing up at people's back gates with their begging bowls and giving blessings and stuff like that, but they own nothing. So Friar Lucas, who is a main character, who's sort of the person who brings Alais into sort of spiritual life, helps her run away from this unwanted marriage. His brother is the bishop of the whole region. And oh, I had so much fun writing him. He may be a little over the top, but he's so cynical. He's so wonderfully cynical. I didn't know I was so cynical. It just flew, it just flew onto the page. Um, and he wants nothing more than to get promoted to Rome. And he begins to see Alais as possibly his ticket to Rome. And so that sets up uh, all sorts of conflicts between Alais, who's like starting to perhaps perform these miracles in the hospital of the Beguines, and the bishop's desire to make a splash, in Bruges. If they're not going to burn somebody, maybe these miracles will get him promoted. Um, and the conflict between the brothers about her and her ultimate decisions about just how to take control of her own fate. Um, so it was a lot of fun writing that sort of trio of characters.
Yeah, they're so interesting. And he is such a great antagonist because he is, as you say, so cynical. And I think he also illustrates like what the church did try to do with a lot of like women mystics, tried to sort of like harness their power and their influence for themselves, feeling threatened by them if they couldn't. I feel like there are, even though she's from a later time, there are a few echoes of like Joan of Arc in her story of like the visions and the sort of the influence that she had on people. Were there other like women's narratives that went into building a lace? Like, did you read a lot of stories about women mystics?
Oh yeah, I mean, I read their original works if they survived. Yeah. I read, Matilda Magdeburg, Hadowitsch, Julian of Norwich, but most of all, she is based on Marguerite Porete. Like, oh, nobody's ever heard of. Marguerite Porete was a Beguine um, who wrote it's actually like a play called A Mirror of Simple Souls, or The Mirror of Simple Souls. And she put it out there. The church reacted negatively, had it burned. She wrote it again. And then when she tried to get approval of it this time, she like lined up all the appropriate sort of approval sources, and some of the church clergy approved it. But then she got caught in this whole political mess, and she ended up, they put her on trial. They took excerpts out of her book that were really condemning and put them before the jury. She remained silent. She remained silent, and they told her she would need to recant or be burned. And that's what happened. In 1310, she was burned at the stake in Place de la Grève in Paris, and people wept because she was so brave. And so Marguerite Porete was definitely in the back of my mind in forming Elise.
The Mirror of Simple Souls is such a remarkable text. And I remember when you encounter these writings from women, like the ones that happen to, like that we are lucky enough that survive,
Yeah,
they feel so different from the authorized, more quote unquote authorized texts that men were writing at the time, that you can understand why they were seen as revolutionary and perhaps a little radical and dangerous.
I know they were really quite different. When you look at what men were writing from the universities, because there were early universities at that time, and they're writing really sort of scholastic, intellectual kinds of treatises on God and how to approach God. And, there was no room for women's voices, right? Women couldn't, preach a sermon. They couldn't, there was no role for them at all. And this ended up being one of the few ways women could have authority. If they could claim that God was speaking directly to them, sometimes they could get away with it. I'm not saying that the mystics were taking advantage of that, but I'm saying it's not surprising that this is how they found their own spirituality. Yeah.
Absolutely. When I was a baby medievalist at 18 when I was in my freshman year, I remember going in with this very sort of reductive idea that like the church could only be a source of oppression for women. And it certainly could be that, like in
Yeah.
many cases. But as I learned more, it was so fascinating to see that the church could be a voluntary choice for so many women. I didn't really appreciate, well, for one thing, like how there not really being any other way to live that wouldn't involve marrying a man and having children, that just like the addition of a new option, of a new way to live your life is so transformative. It's a really fascinating thing.
It is. And the Beguines just sort of striking out on their own. And this happened all over northern and to some extent southern Europe. Even, Italy and Spain had various forms of Beguines. And it's just remarkable how it caught on like wildfire. And they were at first tolerated by the church, but by the Council of Trent in 1312, about 12 years after the action in the story happens, they're condemned. But the Beguines lived on. This is amazing to me. The last Beguine died in, I think it was 1993. Yeah, she lived in Belgium, and she was blind, and she would, Beguines were known for going to people's bedsides at death and helping usher them, into the next life through prayer. She was blind, and she would go to the deathbeds of people and play the accordion and the banjo. I just loved that. But the fact that they still managed to survive all those centuries, I think is testament to how powerful the idea was.
That is amazing. That is a wonderful story that I am so happy to know. Yeah, thank you for sharing this book. I loved it so much, and I feel like it's going to be such a popular read with our crew of historical fiction readers. Before we wrap things up, I'd love to know what's on the horizon for you. Are you still writing? Are you working on something now?
I'm researching something now, which is to say, I'm thinking about writing something now. I don't know if I can pull it off. I love lost manuscript stories, and the actual original revelations of divine love from Julian of Norwich from her cell in 1373 is in fact lost. So I'm thinking of doing a 3 timeline story with a modern historian on the trail of that manuscript, but touching down in 1623 when maybe it crossed the English Channel in the hands of some nuns who were fleeing persecution as Catholics, and then picks up again, in their convent in the French Revolution, when, of course, they're chopping the heads off of all manner of clergy, and they have to escape yet again. And so what happens to this precious, precious book in this time? So I'm thinking of that.
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. I love Julian of Norwich. Her writing, I think in particular, is so beautiful. I remember actually reading it during the pandemic, so I was like, this is just comforting,
Me too.
Yeah.
All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. It's like a mantra.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like on
Yeah.
a post-it by my computer for like, I was finishing my dissertation actually in 2020, 2021, and I was like, I need you, Julian. Like,
I feel that way too. I got to visit her this summer as part of the research for the next book. It was really meaningful to be able to go there. So,
that's amazing.
yeah.
Well, Godspeed with that project, and I'm wishing you well so that we can have you back to talk about that book when it is finished and in the world. So,
Well, thank you. This is really fun. It's great to dish medieval history with someone. So I appreciate it.
thank you. Okay, listeners, please check out Canticle. It's absolutely beautiful, and it will teach you a lot about the Middle Ages while also delivering you a really moving and beautiful story. By the time that you hear this episode, it'll be out in the world, so you could go to your favorite independent bookstore, library, website. Do you have a favorite bookstore you'd like to send people to?
Well, my local one, of course, is Brookline Booksmith. So I know that's not in New York, but they do have online sales. So, yeah.
And it's a good bookstore to support. So thank you again for your time and for sharing your book with me.
Thanks so much, Jen.
No problem. Okay, it's time to say goodbye, listeners. We'll see you next time. It's time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.